Good evening, everybody. We are coming in live from the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology and our guest speakers' homes. Welcome to this Zoom program that we are doing in honor of Nothing Left for Me, Federal Policy and the Photography of Milton Snow and Diné College, a fascinating, groundbreaking exhibit that is unfortunately closing at the end of the semester here at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology. So if you have not had a chance to see it, please join us in person. And without further ado, I'm just going to say a quick intro and introduce our speakers, our esteemed speakers. My name is Julián Antonio Carrillo, and I'm the curator of public programs at the Maxwell Museum. And the event calls for really honoring the social life of this exhibit, which, as I said, is coming down December 6th. And at the same time, a second exhibit, Our Livestock Will Never Diminish, at the Navajo Nation Museum, is celebrating its 4th month. So it's the ending of one and the continuation of another. And for that, we have the co-curators of these two exhibits, Professor Jennifer Denetdale and Professor Lillia McEnaney, who co-curated both of these exhibits. They work together in these two separate yet intersecting exhibition projects, which provoke new questions around collaborative curatorial practices, archival research methodologies, and community-engaged museum pedagogy. This virtual program will explore the ways in which the two exhibits informed and generated each other within the larger context of museum anthropology, Diné studies, and American studies. And we have Dr. Christina Amie, who is Associate Professor at Diné College, researcher on Indigenous relationships with humans and non-human animals, who will be moderating this conversation. And just to give you a brief bio of each presenter, Dr. Jennifer Nez Denetdale is Professor and Chair of the Department of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. As the first ever Diné to earn a PhD in history, Dr. Denetdale is a strong advocate for Indigenous peoples and strives to foster academic excellence in the next generation of students devoted to supporting Indigenous nations and their claims to sovereignty. Lillia McEnaney, co-curator of both exhibits, is a museum anthropologist, independent curator, and assistant professor of museum studies at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Welcome, Lillia, as well. Mm-hmm. And Professor Christina Amie, as already mentioned, associate professor and weaver at Diné College, specializing also in Indigenous animal studies, traditional ecological knowledge, cultural arts, and epistemological imperialism. Mm. We have an amazing group of researchers here, and we welcome all of you on Zoom. And without further ado, I pass on the microphone to Dr. Christina Amie.
Aheha Julian, aheha nutsago koneha, nutso kaigido shido need the Museum of Anthropology, ado aheha do ayoba ahehensin, shay Christine Ami dashache nit kachini nishnan filigana bashichin kohitini dashache, ado biligana dashanale, aheha. Thank you, everybody. Buenos todos y todas a esta conversación esta noche. It's so good to see everybody. I see so many friends joining on. Without further ado, I would like to go ahead and jump into our conversation. I think Julian gave a great introduction, and I believe that through tonight's conversation, we're going to get to know Jennifer and Lillia, perhaps a little bit more than we ever expected. And it's my hope through my moderation and through the work that they have collaboratively put together to bring to our audiences an understanding of of what goes on behind the scenes. There's so much critique that takes place on the final product and the deliverables. And so what I've been able to watch over the past 2 years really has been the emotional strain, not just from, putting together such a very sensitive collection of Milton Snow's photos, but also from, dealing with a lot of the trauma that is associated with hidden histories that through visual sovereignty, we are able to pull out and extract through Diné voices and Diné eyes in what I see is taking place. So I'd like to open up today with just not only a recognition of Julian's work and contribution for this space, but also for a little bit of a story of how I got to meet Lillia and Jennifer. Jennifer gave me a call about 2 years ago. I was in the middle of assessment curriculum development or assessment, just assessment in general. And it's always a hot topic here at the Tribal College. But she was like, Chris, do you want to do this piece for us in the High Country Today, outlet, media outlet? It's on this, coming exhibit about sheep and the livestock reduction. And I'm not gonna lie, but my first reaction was like, nah, I think I'm gonna pass. I don't really, I know a lot about the livestock reduction, which we're going to talk about today, this evening, that took place during the 1930s, up to what people can consider to today, and probably tomorrow and the next coming years. But I was like, I think I'm gonna pass because I don't know why. And then in the back of my head is Jennifer's like pitching this amazing, opportunity to get my work out there, get their work out there, have a tribal college voice associated with the project. I didn't know why it sat so just not comfortable. But I said yes because it was Jennifer Denetdale asking, and she is like the queen of Diné oral history and Indigenous oral history. And I was like, all right, I'll do it. And so I got home to my husband. He's like, if you don't want to do it, why'd you say do it? And I said, because Jennifer was asking. So do you tell Jennifer no? And he was like, yeah, if you want to. But along the routes, she had asked me to show up at the museum over at the Navajo Nation Museum to come check out these images by Milton Slow that were still in archive format. So they were still in their filing cabinets. And I did. And as I was walking up into the museum, the Navajo Nation Museum, and when you guys go to visit, which I hope everybody does, you pass by the mountain sheep exhibit. You don't know it's there, but they're watching you. And I got this pit in my stomach. Like, I don't want to walk in. Like, I was bracing myself to see all of these images of dead animals that had been slain by the United States government in all different types of formats, like flashbacks to what would happen to, the Buffalo massacres at the turn of the century were going through my head. Also flashbacks of what took place with the Canadian Royal patrols and the Inuit dogs that took place in the 1950s were going through my head. So I was planning to see a lot of dead sheep, much in the same fashion as if, when we're cruising on the highway and we go by, these car accidents, and they're deadly car accidents, and there's white blankets covering, somebody's family members that you're passing through, and yet you're looking but you don't want to look. And that's how I felt entering into the museum, and that's why I didn't want to do what was being asked of me. And as I approached the benches, as I approached the tables, the folding tables and the filing cabinets with hundreds and hundreds of unseen images from Milton So's collection just at the Navajo Nation Museum, there was not one dead sheep in that collection. Again, nothing, not one. And I had to really, at that moment, put an analytical lens on, like, okay, so what the heck is going on here? I thought we were doing an exhibit on, the livestock reduction, and that we were taking a look at Milton Snow's photos, and there was not one photo, not even of them friendly butchering or community butchering in the collection. And so that was quite shocking for me to take a look. And then I had to really sit back and understand that we're talking about assimilationist propaganda that was associated to these photos, even though Milton Snow himself was considered a friend of the Navajos. But he was hired by the United States government to document the Collier policies in terms of assimilating the Navajo people, right? The end of the Navajo problem. It's a technical term. People ask me about it all the time. And so those were the kinds of things that I sat with. And once I put that lens on and once I hope you guys all, not just to this conversation, but those images that are still at the Maxwell Museum, that are still over at the Navajo Nation Museum, you will start to see why these images of smiling Navajos, of tribal princesses being lined up at the same time that sheep are being shown and judged at the same criteria, which is the Western viewpoint, what was going on. So without further ado, that is how I met Lillia. That is how I met Jennifer. And I have never been so happy to be part of a living project as what's going on here. We have 2 exhibits plus 1 book publishing taking place. So with that story, my friends, as they say in my son's digital world, I'm going to open up some questions that have come from our Milton anthropology crew, as well as just from knowing Lillia's work and Jennifer's conversations and her mentorship. Jennifer, tell me about the first time you heard Milton Snow, the name. If you could let us know, like, what was the first thing that popped into your head?
I actually, when I think back about, and thank you, and I want to thank you, Kristen and Lily and Julian for doing this or coordinating this. I'm really appreciative, and I'm really appreciative to our listeners for spending an evening with us. And so thank you very much. Um, I hadn't really thought, it's been a long time. It's been like 15 to 20 years since I started working on these photographs. And I do have a background that began in graduate school of studying historic photographs of Navajos, but it's within the larger framework of photographs of Native people and then Indigenous photography. So I actually think that one of the first times I came into contact or knew, first of all, snow photographs are familiar to Navajo people, except we often don't know the context. We don't know who Snow is. We don't know why he took so many photographs. And so the images are familiar. Um, but I think one of one of the things about this was reading Will Wilson's dissertation. And so that's like the only full-length study of Snow's photographs.
Great. And if you guys, what Jennifer's referring to, if you guys walk into the Window Rock Lowe's, you will see snow photos. They canvas the entire shopping market. So even though we are in like this heart of the food desert, you walk in and you see these beautiful pictures of agricultural practices, of weaving practices, of all of these arenas, and they make great backdrops. But
Yeah,
I, including myself, never asked where they came from. Just kind
yeah,
of that they were there. I mean, who wasn't at that time during it was like the turn of like move out of salvage anthropology, like what was going on in that time period, like who hadn't been to the Navajo to take photos and start their career kind of thing. And they're nice, they're beautiful images that he's
yeah.
captured. So that is one of the contexts that we see Snow's images as. And when I met Jennifer, she pitched Lillia on the phone so hard. She was like, and I'm working with Lillia McEnaney, and this project could not come to light without Lillia. And so, and Lillia, don't turn around on us here. But I'm wondering, what were your first reactions when Jennifer asked you to be on this project? Like, what were you like, all right, let's do it because it's a job, or did we think a little bit deeper in terms of like, oh, the content and the impact?
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris, and thank you everybody for being here. It's a joy to be able to spend time with everybody, even if it's virtual. And thank you to the Maxwell and Julian for organizing. I always say that one of the best things about this work is being able to do fun things with people that you love. And this project is an example of being able to do really, really interesting work grounded in fantastic relationships with community members and colleagues throughout the region. So initially, I do want to give some kudos to the person who initially introduced Jennifer and I, Dr. Deborah Romanak, who was the former curator of exhibitions at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology. She knew of my interests. I'm trained as a museum anthropologist, and I'm really interested in the politics of representation as museum anthropology and visual anthropology intersect. So Deborah very kindly introduced Jennifer and I as kind of someone who can work with the Maxwell exhibition initially. For those of you who have not seen both exhibitions or are not kind of familiar with the background to these projects, I want to give like a little bit of context. So the Maxwell Museum exhibition opened first, and then that is kind of how Jennifer and I got acquainted with each other and also with the larger collection at the University of New Mexico. And it was kind of, and we can get more into this later on, but it was kind of using the university museum in the most generative possible way, right? As a place for teaching and experimentation and innovation that is inherent in the ethos of university museums, right? So Jennifer and I kind of were able to start thinking about these questions through the smaller collection at the University of New Mexico. And then the former director of the Navajo Nation Museum, Manny Wheeler, and Jennifer brought me into this larger Henry Luce funded project at the Navajo Nation Museum. And I was extraordinarily honored and continue to be at every stage to have the privilege to learn with and work from Jennifer. My undergraduate advisor is here on the Zoom, and I first learned about Dr. Denetdale's work through one of the classes in that department. And so Dr. Denetdale's work has been really formative, not only in my academic career, but she's just like a force of nature, as I'm sure pretty much everyone in the Zoom room knows. And as we've developed our relationship, I think we've come to realize the ways in which our skills complement each other, and we can really kind of, I don't know, I just have a lot of fun working with Dr. Denetdale. And again, Chris, to your point about the hesitations, I think I can kind of wrap up this answer soon, but as a non-native person kind of working in these spaces, I always see my role as that of a facilitator, right? So I'm not an expert on Navajo communities and is not even close to my place to be that expert. And so I really hold and aim to hold expertise in the museum as a structure, as a process and a product of the American Colonial Project, and then also have the kind of project management nitty-gritty stuff that people don't like to do is what I like to do to kind of be able to facilitate really meaningful community-based work.
Such important work. That nitty-gritty stuff is really like the behind the scenes. I don't know, like making flyers is like one of my big things. But those kinds of things like filing and understanding and bringing what goes on behind the scenes at the museum, even getting access to archives is quite a process sometimes. And so I feel that definitely I could feel your support system in that realm. Now, along those lines, and this one goes to Jennifer. And by the way, feel free to take each other's space up. I'm okay with that. But thinking about like hesitation. So Lilia talked a little bit about hesitations, just being like a non-native working at the Maxwell, which does have a long history of colonizing indigenous spaces. We're talking totem pole theft. It's got like a very deep history in that realm. And then, bringing Jennifer, who's also affiliated with the institution, to kind of be like, all right, let's start knocking down on the doors to see what's going on here. Even though I'm not native, maybe I can participate, right? How can I do that? But for Jennifer, you're coming on from a different standpoint. You're coming on with a different history and legacy, if I can go ahead and extend it to that point. What kind of, hesitations did you have about such an expansive project? We're talking 2 exhibits over the course of 2 years, plus in the 3rd year, the release of a book publishing based off of these exhibits and the images that they're holding.
Let me say first that a project of this size would have been more difficult without the generous funding of the Henry Luce Foundation. The Luce Foundation was just incredibly generous in funding the Navajo Nation Museum exhibition and supporting the forthcoming book on Snow's photographs. And so just to be able to have the freedom to plan and to bring in consultants, community Navajo community people, and community members who aren't all Navajo. So that was just really amazing to me. And then my response from my own people, from the Navajo Nation and from Navajo people, always I always want to make sure I do a good job, and sometimes you don't know what the response is going to be. One of some of my favorite things to do was just to call people up and say, hey, like for example, I had a wonderful time. We have one photograph, and I think we're going to show it, of the Gallup Indian Center. So I called people I knew who were young in the 70s and asked them about the Gallup Indian Center. And I'm writing furiously as they're saying, oh, yeah, I remember the Gallup Indian Center. This is what we did there. And this is the only one that we have that is outside of the Navajo Nation. And so just trying to make sure that I have community response to the work that I do, and that you can't meet everybody's approval, but that my own people care about the work.
I think you bring up a really good point, especially when we talk about research. One of my big aims, especially teaching Indigenous research, is I teach my students like teaching like Indigenous statistics, right? Take away the neutral. Take away
Yeah.
the neutral because you want to engage individuals who want to be engaged, first of all.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
second of all, you want them to feel somehow, right? Some way. And so even by putting like a neutral marking on, did you like the exhibit? Neutral, right?
Mhm.
It's already putting you in a negative connotation. So what
Yeah.
Jennifer, I feel you're talking to is like, even if you don't like it, let's start to articulate why.
Yeah.
What like the initial reactions to even thinking about participating in such and what I was foreseeing to be like this atrocious like presentation, which it is once you understand the context that is being hidden underneath the images, the black and white images. So I definitely it's a scary place, Jennifer,
It
to
is.
um,
It is.
and when I remember thinking about that, writing about the opening of this exhibit, like, okay, it's one thing to present being at the Maxwell, right?
Mhm.
The toughest critic will always be bringing that back home, right? And in this case, it wasn't bringing back home. It was just unearthing what was already here, right? What's already been stored here, but we just haven't had time or the access. And we can talk about museum accessibility if you guys are interested in that in a little bit as well. Um,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like as we're talking about both of these exhibits, I've been referring to them kind of as sister exhibits. I don't know why that sits nicely with me. I don't know if it's like a literary like imagery that we can take a look at, but like we have these exhibits that exist. How did the sister exhibit come? Like, why two exhibits? How did that come about? Was that because of, let's say, funding was available to do that, or was it something that was in the immediate planning? Let's have two exhibits.
You know, the- with the Max, and Lily could answer some part of this too. A part of this too is that the director of the Maxwell Museum, Carla, invites me to come and, look at the exhibit or share my expertise on the livestock reduction, the history. I'm a historian by training, and the snow photograph. So it kind of just unfolded that way. And then I was introduced to Lillia, who was a consultant, Lillia, for it. And we just hit it off really well. It was so seamless that I don't even remember what our introduction was to each other. We just started working together. But the Navajo Nation Museum one was in process, was already in the thinking stages, planning stages, when I was invited to work on the Maxwell Museum one. So I started out with the Loose Foundation in terms of funding, and then I was thinking, so they were going to they were inviting a proposal for me for the Navajo Nation Museum exhibition, and Manny Wheeler, who was the director of the Navajo Nation Museum, then was always supportive of my work. And I think I haven't asked him this, but just from my conversations with Manny, was that he'd read my book, the one on Nihinaaldlooshii, which is a personal history of my genealogy and a Navajo history of particularly the colonial under the American colonial period. So with that publishing of that book, Manny would, Manuelito Wheeler was named for Manuelito, he told me. And so I had a relationship with the museum, and he said, sure, we can do this. So that one was already in the planning stage. And then when I called curators at national museums across the country, because I've been a consultant for museums and I've written labels, but I was never in charge of a whole exhibition. So I was calling different museums, and like, yeah, a good exhibition is probably like a little over 2 years in planning. I'm like, okay. And then and then they said, well, an exhibition a good one costs over $120,000. And I was like, oh crap. I'm not getting any $120,000 soon, So it was kind of eye-opening. And I'm not the person who knows about how you put museums together. I'm kind of like the idea girl. Lillia?
Yeah, I think this whole concept of having two exhibitions on a similar topic in two different places, two different institutions, two different publics is something that I have not encountered in the literature in museum anthropology. It is something that I think is really interesting to think with in terms of, Chris, you've kind of framed it previously about like the bridges and fissures between these two institutions and the ways in which we're telling similar stories, but they're two different collections, right? That's also something that I want to make sure is clear for folks with us right now. So the University of New Mexico has one collection, which is significantly smaller than the one that is housed in Window Rock at the Navajo Nation Museum. The Museum of Northern Arizona also has a collection. So it's really kind of separate, but also very intersecting. And I think before we kind of get into that, I really want to highlight what I see as the bridges between and the benefits of doing this in this particular way. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the incredible opportunities afforded at university museums that allow for kind of curatorial dreaming and curatorial play. So I think it's like 2022, right? And Jennifer and I are working on this collection at the Maxwell, but it's also really important to kind of look back at the history of the way that this collection has been contextualized and exhibited. And I'm going to kind of answer your question by providing a little bit of background on the exhibitionary history of this collection, which is actually some details that Dr. Denetdale and I just found out more recently. So the first time these images were displayed was in 1939 during the ceremonial in Gallup. And Snow curated an exhibit of 12 of his own images and 7 like larger flip books of photographs that visitors could go through themselves. And in a job application a few years after that, he described the purpose of this exhibition that he put together of his own work. And he said, quote, "The purpose of the exhibit was to promote better cooperation between the government and the Navajo Indians," unquote, right? That's fascinating. That's huge. And that shows a really clear purpose and a kind of glimpse into his mind and his rationale for doing this work. And then moving forward, like 30, 40 years, right? What was then known as the Navajo Tribal Museum opened in 1961. Different building, different institutional structure. But then by the mid-1980s, the former director of the Navajo Nation Museum, Russ Hartman, installed a series of about, he can't remember, and there are unfortunately no records of the show, which like kills me. There are a series of like 10 or 15 images in the foyer of the museum. And he asked the question, does anyone know who these people are or where these images were taken? So this unnamed and, like I said, unarchived exhibition is important to our story, right? Because it's the first reframing of the collection for the community. And around the same time, this is bringing it back to the UNM connection, Hartman also curated an exhibition for the Navajo Studies Conference, which was at UNM Gallup in the mid-80s. So again, there's these long exhibitionary histories behind these photographs. And even though we don't know much about these previous exhibitions, we do know that people experienced them, right? We know that these images were viewed, they were cataloged, they were interpreted, and they carried meaning, right? And so this kind of brings us to our central question throughout all of these projects, which is, what is it that photographs actually do? So now I will actually answer your question. So I think that the value of having these two exhibitions for two different audiences centers and really speaks to the iterative nature of photography, in which photographs and archives are they're molten in their form, right? They change meaning based on who is viewing them, when, where, and in what context. And they are as much to think with as they are representative of a thing, right? So they're sites for storytelling, learning, remembering, and constituting meaning in new ways, right? Like exhibitions, museums, archives, photographs are all meaning-making machines and constitute the realities in which we all live and the histories that we all understand. So by doing these several different exhibitions, we're being able to imbue these photographs with new meanings and new contexts kind of across communities.
Cool.
I think that's great because you talk a lot about, okay, so these are more than just tangible sites of memory, right? Which, like, and we use that in research all the time. And I think that that's the best part about this particular project and walking through the exhibit, because we still have tangible memories of a lot of these images through oral history, through our own practices. So when you're walking through the exhibit itself, if you just glance at the exhibit, yeah, it's black and white photos. There's some Indians, there's some white guys in there, I think, maybe. There's a whole bunch of sheep. There's a couple tribal princesses, and it looks like government building, lots of government buildings. But once you start looking at it, and what Jennifer's talking about, for example, with the Gallup Indian Center, right? The image that she just referenced, I remember that, or I remember my grandmother went there. And so we start using the images that were utilized to demonstrate how tame the Navajo had become. Because as I remind my students, who some of them are in here, the BIA who hired, right, Collier was never meant to be a permanent institution, right? 20 years, it was supposed to be an agency that was supposed to disappear, like a disappearing task force, to deal with the Indian problem. And Collier was sent to tame the Indians and take care of the Navajo problem. And so those are the things that we also have to keep in mind. It's like, okay, the government needs to demonstrate this taming. The government needs to demonstrate what's going on here. So in that isolation, right, they become very angry centered, points of well, now what? But when we start looking at them and you actually walk through the exhibits, even with no words, walking through the Maxwell Museum, I could see over in Talani Lake, heading towards Sand Springs, I could see our mesa. I could see our mesa. That's our mesa. People are back there. Nobody was there when I was growing up, but these people were back there. And not only they were back there, were demonstrating that there was water and irrigation back there in this area that by the time I was growing up in that area, was absolutely desolate. And so now we start seeing, and now I'm seeing people move back into these areas and start to, push these waterways. And so it speaks a lot, like, even though I wasn't around in the 1930s, I can see these geographical formations that are very much definitions of who I am and where I come from. And so those are the things that, like, when we talk about more than a tangible memory, walking through them becomes this immersive experience without even text. if you can understand the context, that's like the images that are going in. So I think that that was one of the most powerful things, at least when I was walking through, that I could see. I could see our mesa, like that's our mesa. What's our mesa doing there? Um, but along those lines, so we see this bridging, right, of this idea of how photographs can be utilized in the contemporary sense, not just for assimilationist purposes. Was there like an emergent bridge that came out post exhibit launching? Because that's one of the things that I love to look at when I'm conducting research is like you go in, you know that you're going to do this. These are your objectives. Check, 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 check. And then you're like, oh man, oh crap. Did you see what just happened? It could be in terms of reaction. It could be in terms of lines of thought that you guys saw. But was there an emergent that popped up that you weren't necessarily expecting at the beginning of the project?
You know, one of the things of working with Lillia is that she really helped put what I was thinking and what was imagining into material form, into a conception, into organization. And we had these conversations where I'd be thinking about ideas and I'd be thinking about things that I wanted to impress upon the audience. For the Maxwell Museum one, I wanted people to know that there's a fixed border around the photographs and that there is a meaning outside of the photographs, a context that you can get in the stories that come through the memories of our people, but are also present in archives and reports and countless documents. The memories are there, they just don't showcase them, and they're not evident in the photographs. And so I wanted that sense of what's not there to be there. People, how do people get that impression? Okay. For the other one, for the Navajo Nation one, I wanted our people to think about the legacies of livestock reduction, like what came out of that period that we're dealing with now, and I also was reliant on our people who speak the language, who's told us really beautiful stories of how to convey that it's not possible to convey it in English. One of the people that we talked to, an elder, he was at, bless his heart, he came to the I can't remember if he came to the preview or to the official opening. So I was talking to him and I said, so what do you think? And he's like, well, it's done, But he calls me and he texts me, and he says, oh, there was this other thing that I wanted to share with you. And he's speaking to me in Navajo and telling me these stories. And so for me, putting in what I hear from our people, and knowing what I do from history was something that I wanted to bring together in both of these exhibitions.
Yeah, and I think, Jennifer, if you don't mind me adding on to
Yes,
that, I
yes,
think
of course.
the title of the two exhibitions is really
Yeah,
instructive for the difference in curatorial goals and audience in particular.
Mhm.
So by saying nothing left for me, that's a direct contradiction to our livestock will never diminish in Window Rock, right? So we're
Mhm.
really thinking about two very, very different audiences. And like Dr. Denetdale said, what we really wanted visitors to come from both of them. But Chris, to your question about the unexpected bridges, I did not know that we were going to do a book. So that was something that I think really allowed both projects to come together in a really spectacular way. We have some of our book contributors here on the Zoom, so thank you guys for being here. But we have 14 chapters, right, with authors engaging with images from both the University of New Mexico collection and the collection in Window Rock, all in one volume. And Chris is one of the contributors. Her chapter is spectacular poetry. And one other, in addition to having all of these additional voices written into the catalog, what we also did, we have an extraordinarily robust and tedious to put together plates section at the end of the book, with over 130 plates, in which, and they're plates from both collections, plus the collection in Flagstaff altogether. And what we did to kind of merge the two narratives from both exhibitions together is we included the extended captions from both exhibitions in that plate section. So you can see kind of both narratives mixing and kind of changing tone. And I think the question of tone and voice and kind of curatorial and editorial voice is a really important one throughout all of these conversations, and kind of decentering that authoritative curatorial voice and centering multivocality. And I know we'll talk a little bit about community collaboration and exhibitionary practice later on, but I think that that book project really is the bridge for the two projects in very particular ways. And I don't think we've mentioned it's coming out with the University of New Mexico Press in fall 2026.
Yes.
Exciting
Plug
stuff.
for the book.
And you never think, and that's for those of you guys who are thinking about exhibits, and I've done so many exhibits, it's always been such a hindsight, like, oh, I should have cataloged this. What was I thinking? Oh, I mean, and not just like for like tenure and like, because like when you're thinking about publishing and you're thinking about like my tenure friends are always thinking about like what could have been, what could we have done? But just in terms of taking these collections that do get so little light. And the way that I look at these collections and going into the archives and pulling out these negatives and these black and white that need to be redigitized and stuff like that. It's kind of like you're waking them up, right? They're always there. They've been there. And so I was thinking about that when we were talking about these guys. It's like they're just sleeping right there, and they're these sleeping stories. And we just literally need to pull them apart. It's so much like I talk a lot, and I have a book coming out about like sheep and sheep butchering. Like every part that you pull out of the sheep has its own individual story, and every photograph. I tell my students this, I'm telling you guys this, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because it's taken from a Western camera, processed through Western development process. The man behind the lens was a non-Navajo Western, right? Trained in a Western system. Doesn't mean that it's useless to us. Doesn't mean that we throw it out. Doesn't mean that we can't utilize it. Doesn't mean we don't have authority over it. And I think that what these collections, for me anyway, that was for me the best part of it, because like I said, I entered into it with a little hesitation, came out a full believer, and so I appreciate that. We're gonna go ahead and jump ahead a little bit because I know we have so much to talk about and so little time to thinking about like collaborative curations in terms of just in general, right? I've had not so great collaborative, native, non-native structures, like collaborative projects in which like Lily talks about a lot when we talk about like epistemological imperialism, where the non-native all of a sudden takes over the entire voice of the project. And at the same time, I've seen other museum exhibits in which we want our community members to have the voice, but they don't have the professionalism or the experience in order to deliver, right, the vision of so that it's communicable to a larger public. In your experiences, and this goes to both of you guys, what is in general the benefit for collaborative curation?
I think for me as a Diné and an Indigenous scholar, it kind of like you just don't do that kind of work. The last 2 or 3 weeks I've been talking to different Indigenous scholars, and always starts with community-based scholarship. I was in Denver, and then I drove to Rosebud, and I spent 3 weeks there. It's just kind of like what we do as Indigenous scholars, that it's community-based research and collaboration. It's always been like that for me. That's been like what's really important to me. And when I'm saying collaboration, it's listening to my own people. One of the greatest joys for me as I get older is having the opportunity and privilege to listen to my elders, just completely in the Nebuchadnezzar, to just sit there and soak it up and to listen. I can remember a couple of summers ago listening to a professor from Diné College, and they say he's going to be talking for 30 minutes, you know, an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes later, I'm just like, wow, that was so incredible, you know. So I just like, it's kind of just what you do, you know, and what you're supposed to do. The other thing is that collaboration is just really hard. It's not, sometimes it doesn't come out the way you think it might. Sometimes you learn lessons as lessons learned, and I won't do that again, you know, kind of thing. But for me, collaborative research is just, it's joyous for me. I really, that's the relationships that I've created, that I've established for long term, um, are the joy of research. Lilia.
Yeah. So I think we all kind of know that collaborative curatorial praxis really actively and tangibly works against these larger imperial histories and colonial structures of the museum as a process and product of the American project, right? So on the most basic level, right, collaboration actively kind of works to decenter this idea of the authority of the curator, right? When I teach my intro to curation class, it's always about kind of dismantling this idea of the singular expert, right? Which is who is usually non-native, male, authoritative, and he's telling you what to think and how to think, right? It's like the museum talking at you. But collaboration allows for like this incredible multivocality and the diversification of perspectives that reflect the realities of living in the world and living in community, right? And this also facilitates knowledge exchange between all everybody involved in the collaboration, not only the people working on the exhibition, but those viewing the exhibition and those who come to public programs like all of you here, right? And it's more about co-creation and creating new knowledge together as friends and as colleagues rather than as extractive industries, which anthropology is, right? And museum studies is. And I also think it's important to define collaboration and kind of be intentional about using that word too, because I think it's very trendy in academia right now to talk about collaboration because it makes your work sound better in this current moment, right? And we can, I know we're short on time, but in the questions, we can maybe talk through what that means, like consultation versus collaboration versus partnership, right? And those conversations also echo the really important conversations around like decolonization versus indigenizing something, right? But to Jennifer's point about the difficulties of collaboration, like that's super real for non-native people too. It's like everything in the world is challenging, right? And especially making sure that you are working at the speed of trust, I think is kind of the most important thing. That kind of goes back to my whole thing about one of my colleagues told me this when I was much earlier in my career, and she kind of explained, Alicia Poon, she's the director of the Indian Arts Research Center at the School for Advanced Research, and she kind of frames her work as effective project management being the key to community-based research practice, right? Because effective budgeting and scheduling, being responsive to community needs and being malleable in all of those ways that institutions typically don't allow for, that is what makes collaboration on my end actually happen, right? So kind of convincing your institution that you need to kind of throw away your schedule and we're going to be working at the needs of the community and we're going to be scheduling around individual schedules, community schedules, etc. So yeah, I mean, there are challenges, but to Jennifer's point, I mean, it's such a joy. I mean, just being able, like I said earlier, to go out and like hang with friends and colleagues and learn with and from each other and then create something, like what could be cooler than that?
Yeah.
Sounds very ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
is what you hope for, right? You aim for because
Right.
you don't
Yeah.
build collaborations with people at the whim, right? It's something that takes, and I think you hit the nail on the head right there, like, this idea of trust. Like, do I trust this person? And even if I do trust them, how do we continue to build a relationship of trust? Trust isn't something that you establish and then you walk away from, which we so see, like, especially in, what we would call pseudo collaborative projects, right? Typically they're consultating. So let's go consult and let's bring back and then let's do what we want to do with the project instead of, all right, consistent back and forth along the way. This is what I got. What do you think? Okay, we can tweak this there. I don't know so much about that and being able to step up. So that give and pull of collaboration and of trust, because like I said, trust isn't something that's static. It's something that in itself, it's its own relationship. It expands, it pulls back in when it needs to. And I've seen you guys, the way that you've worked with community members, especially on the scope of this project. I'm like, I don't know if I could have done that. I don't know if I had the patience for that, to like be so calm with yourself and calm with people. And I think that comes with experience. And I think that part of it is personality for sure. But to seeing that develop in both of your guys' projects and in terms of how, you're there, I'm gonna send the invite anyway. Right. I'm not sure how these people feel, but I'm going to make that phone call anyway. I'm not sure what their reaction is going to be if they're on board or not, but you know what? Let's send that letter anyway and see, what works, and always kind of like being there on the end of the phone for when there is a receptive line, not to pick, like to pigeon pick, like, all right, we got them, right? But to be like, okay, well, maybe this is an opportunity for a growth, to take place. So I appreciate that. I note that from you guys. I note that from just working with you and your patience with me. But even with like the editing process, I'm going to jump to the book for a hot second, because the book is, once again, I do see as this bridging that Lilia pointed out, this idea of bringing these two together, but allowing community voices. That's a collaborative project to, put their story down on paper and then, you know, let's just get the story. What's your story? You want you to look at this image and tell me your story. How are you connecting with it? And then don't worry about the technical components. Don't worry about that. We want to work together here. Your area of expertise, creative writing. Great, let's do that. Your area of expertise is you're a photographer. Let's do that. You're a poet. Great, let's do that. You're a mom. Great, let's do that. Now let's pull all these guys in, because what we look at when you look at these images is not just the singular male patriarchal, the system, right? As many of these images get pulled in, but you have community, and community has all of these people and all of these voices that can contribute. So I think that is quite, I know it sounds utopic for our audience members. It does. It is. It's like a dream team, kind of what we're looking at here, and we can aspire to, right? As growing researchers. With that, I'm not sure if you guys would think about, for example, any doubts that you guys had about the project in terms of talking about, so the second one in particular, which talks about the livestock reduction. And Jennifer, like the title of it is like our livestock will never diminish. And I think about our current policies. I think about our sheep. I think about how, will never diminish. Well, as it's no longer the system or the man, right? Where is sheep on our, agendas? Where is the grazing permits on the council? We talk about the we talk about those types of philosophies, and then they're not there. So for me, walking in and seeing that title was like, okay, what is this going to tell me about not diminishing? Because we're kind of butchering our own sheep without replenishing, if that makes sense. Like, we're not restocking the herd, we're not taking care of husbandry from, the government level, the political level. We use sheep as a propaganda all the time. You can see them on campaign posters. And so your project brings it back down to, let's listen to the people who are taking care of the sheep. Let's listen to the people who are having grazing pit permit issues. Let's listen to what is in the treaty, what is allowable, what isn't allowable, and taking all these very abstract documents that, for me as somebody who has sheep, I don't like to deal with, but impacts our lives daily. So I think that's phenomenal. But did you guys have any kind of, like, I don't know, hesitation about the trauma that was associated with all of that? those realities, I guess.
I think for me as a historian and having been in numbers of archives and having to reach history, it's always trauma. You know, I just came out of my class. I have an undergrad and grad cohort, and we talked about history and the trauma that's associated with that history. And then when you talk about Indigenous history, you know, you start with land and land dispossession. You talk about elimination of Indigenous people as distinct Indigenous peoples, you know. And so it's always there. And I'm not someone who's particularly interested in performing trauma. And I'm not interested in relaying trauma stories for the sake of relaying trauma stories. I'm aware of the trauma and the devastation of livestock. It's not in the photographs. We're told on the one hand, Snow did take photographs of some of the slaughter. We haven't seen it. And then someone else says, well, there aren't any like that. And as Chris pointed out, this is propaganda. You know, these are photographs that were intended to assure federal officials and the larger audience that Navajo people did embrace livestock reduction policies. You know, that was the intent, and also to educate Navajos about superior Western technology around land rehabilitation, better sheep breeding, and educating Navajos on this was also critical to the Navajo problem. You know, so we never get away from the trauma. How we decide we're going to respond to it, I think, is important. Carolyn Johnson, from Black Mesa, from Dislejeen, who was on our livestock reduction panel 2 summers ago, we got the title from something she said, and it was just a joy to listen to Carolyn, just to hear her speak to Nebazad. You hunger to hear your language. You're lonely for your language. My language learner, my primary language speakers have left, my mom and dad, and I miss our language. You know, so just to sit and listen to her was just an incredible joy. Carolyn's from Black Mesa. That is one of the most isolated regions in our land. She lives by livestock grazing, you know, with all of the hardships of hauling water, you know. I was just inspired by what she was saying in terms of will never diminish. I also don't want to hit people over the head about the permits, but the permits are there. I want my people to think about where this comes from. And it's difficult to talk about. Livestock permits were not handed down from God to Moses on a tablet. People act like they were. It is possible to change your land management when it doesn't fit the times, but we're not even about close to having that kind of conversation. So where do you start the conversation, you know? And so I think for me, the exhibition was also a place to talk about where do you start these conversations, you know? The poor infrastructure, the loss of the livestock was really part of elimination. It was the beginning of the relocation policies of the 1950s. It's the reason why we're in border towns and in search of wage work. You know, people need to make these connections. And so, but I don't want to hit people over the head with it. I want people to go, oh, okay, I didn't know that, you know, and then to think about it. So that was that's how I deal with it. Lillia?
Yeah, I mean, I think this echoes a lot of the challenges that colleagues in museums working in genocide and Holocaust museums and institutions deal with, right? And I think Dr. Denetdale's point about kind of this balance between re-traumatizing the visitor versus education is a really tricky line to toe. But the point about kind of using the exhibition as a starting point for conversation, I think, is a really important one. And also just understanding exhibitions and museums in general as not being representative of something, but being an entry point into thinking about something. And I think that for me is kind of how I've conceptualized that. But I think there's no one answer to that question, right? It's just a continuous conversation about how we talk about these things depending on what context we're talking in and for what purpose.
No, I think that that you guys speak very, very poignantly to you. And for our audience members who jumped on and who don't necessarily know too much about the livestock reduction, there were two major waves that took place, and like we said, a continual wave. But in that first wave that hit, there were thousands of Diné livestock that were either hauled off to meat processing facilities by force. They were run off canyon cliffs to fall to their deaths. And the most, for me anyway, the most horrific, descriptions of what took place were that livestock were spread with like coal oil and then set ablaze alive while their owners, while their stewards were watching. And at rifle point, so there was no interceding that was possible on behalf of them. And so when we talk about that, at least from an Indigenous animal studies perspective, and when we talk about what does sheep is life, when we talk about the bed, the Nedbeina, there's a co-constitutive existence that when sheep no longer exist in the practice that we were taught to teach them, we as Diné people will no longer exist. And so the slaughter of the sheep in that fashion was something that they could no longer do to Diné people because we were now US citizens as of 1924. But when we take a look at that, it's something that if they could have, it's something that would be, possibly conceived to have been done to our own people. And so that is when we take a look at co-constitutive existence between animals and Indigenous peoples. It's not something that's like very floaty, fairy type, go, hang out with Pocahontas and Miko on the canoe around the river bend. We're talking about, right, this idea that once sheep no longer to exist, once we as Diné co-stewards are unable to take care of our animals in the fashion that we are supposed to take care of them, then it's not just a destruction of a life way, it's a destruction of ourselves. And so that becomes a really big point of topic, at least that when I bring my students to the exhibit, that we get a chance to start exploring like, so like, what does sheep mean to you? Right? Is it somebody that you just go and throw hay to and then on your way? Or are we starting to take it into consideration the cost of taking sheep? Because there is an economic cost. It's not free. Our mutton is not free. It's one of my hated phrases that I hear. Why would I pay for money over at mutton for at TNR when I have mutton and I can have mutton in my croffery? It is not. The time. I know I can see my shepherding friends and my sheep friends in the panel. So I really want to respect that time that you guys put into it, the finance, the heart, and the traditional knowledge. Jennifer talked about language that's associated with it. It's more than just language. It's, all these practice, knowing how to go get herbs for your sheep, knowing how to take care of those things. And it's not to culture shame who knows and who doesn't know. It's about to see, okay, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to pivot? What's going to go? And so these exhibits really start to bring that to life in two different audiences, right? Even our Native friends who are no longer living on the reservation and live in Albuquerque, right? It brings up that consideration, like, okay, well, where, even though we are Diné, we have different life experiences in existence. So thank you guys for that. And I think that when we take a look at that, I know we're cutting our close on time, but I wanted to thank Lillia for really talking about the visual anthropology component, because I think that you highlighted that. But I also wanted to jump into visual sovereignty.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah. So if you guys wanted to talk about that and think about like, how do you reach into the photos to pull out these stories?
Maybe we could do that by looking at some of the images. I know one of the in the
Mhm.
chat said, can you show? So maybe we could start just talking about that with some of the images. With the
And
Navajo Nation Museum, the Navajo Nation Museum's collection, I hear different numbers. Lily, you can tell me if I'm in the ballpark range, but the Navajo Nation Museum owns about 14,000. Is that correct,
14,
Lillia?
15, 14,
Yeah,
15.
belong to the Navajo Nation. The the Museum of Northern Arizona also has a substantial collection, and the Museum of Northern Arizona also owns the images of snow. The Maxwell Museum owns about 280. Is that right, Lillia? If I remember correctly?
That sounds about right. Carla, feel free to jump in if you have the
Yeah,
number in front of you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Navajo Nation one, you know, over the years, scholars who are interested in mostly to use the photographs as illustrations, for example, of a study they're doing, well asked to see the snow collection. Will Wilson's photograph, MFA, dissertation, which is at the University of New Mexico, is the first full-length study of Snow's photographs. So one of the things that, you know, you're always finding all these sections of fascinating just to know the history of certain things and things that we've taken for granted, or it's something, and I ask my students to do that, is the place that we live, the places that we are, to learn about that place, you know. And so I was interested in Window Rock as an administrative center, and to think about how the tribal council is the only structure within when John Collier, U.S. Indian Commissioner, commissioned to have a design of an administrative center. It wasn't intended for Navajo people. It wasn't intended for Navajo leaders. It was intended for federal employees so they could better effectively administrate to Navajo people. And so the only structure historically that was meant for Navajos was the tribal council chambers, you know. And so here's one of the photographs of Collier speaking to Navajo leaders, and this is inside the tribal council chamber. And of course, one of the things, because I'm a historian who pays attention to gender, you will notice that there's primarily almost all men in there. This period in Navajo politics, there's nothing that ever tells you A, B, and C, this happened, and this happened. You have to kind of read a whole bunch of stuff to figure out how the leadership and how the formation of tribal delegates was being formed and dissolved and being reformed again over. And so I had to read a bunch of stuff just to get a straight a chronology of the formation of the tribal council. So another one, Lillia, that you want to talk about?
I already talked about that one. Oh, Jennifer, do you want to talk about the previous one? And then I can go ahead.
Okay, speaking of collaborative collaborative research and drawing on histories that you've done before, I've been to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, maybe 4 times, and the Cumberland Historical Society holds the documents of Carlisle Indian School. The War College in Carlisle has these beautiful albums, portrait albums, and one of the in some of the portrait in the albums, you have photographs of Tom Torlino. And so here's a photograph by Milton Snow of an elderly Tom Torlino. And it was just wonderful to be able to talk to his granddaughter and ask her, will you provide us with a statement, a comment on this photograph? And so she did. And so we learned quite a bit about Tom Torlino and how he returned home to his Crown Point community, and how he, in his own right, became a respected leader in his community. He was also a Navajo scout. So I think for me and for Navajo people, it's always kind of wonderful just to hear these kinds of historical information about the photographs.
Awesome. And I think when we talk about visual sovereignty, right, pulling in and starting to really understand those histories is so important in terms of what we do in the future, right? I'm going to kind of jump forward. This was a piece that I had that really stuck out to me. Not because of anything in particular, actually. It was because, as Jennifer asked if I could pick a picture and see if I could develop, a project around it for the book publishing. And in this particular image, as I was going through the photos, my two sons who are 6 and 8 were running by. I think they were like they were a little bit younger then, and they like stopped at this photo and they're like, "Look, it's your mom and you." And so when my sons saw this image, they immediately clung onto it because this is how we farm.
Mhm.
So I got a chance to like they were like, "No, mom, look, this is how we line up our squash. This is how we grow our corn. This is what we do." And so at the very little ages of 6 and 8, we got a chance to talk about not just the fact that that the planting, right, is there, but also the rolling landscape. So we talked about the different landscapes of where this particular image comes, which comes from Fort Defiance, and we're up against the Chuskas. So we talked about the different mountains, but we also talked about the power lines that were behind them, because we have power lines that run up our back, the distance back. And so those type of details that these little guys are picking up make this a great exercise to go into the museum, because when we go into the museum, we typically don't, all right, let's go to the storytelling section, let's go to the kids section. But if we take them from the library to the other side of where the museum is, actually where this exhibit is, and ask them what do they see, right, you will be surprised at the life ways that they are able to pull out. And so we were able to talk about the transition from dry farming into irrigation farming, because we don't irrigate, and we do a practice of dry farming. And so we were talking about that. But this particular image speaks to, right, this reintroduction of farming and agricultural practices. And in today's day and age, especially when we're talking about what's going on with the government and the cutting of snaps and everybody's pushing food sovereignty, it's something that you have to plan for. It's something that's not very continual. You can't just pick it up because government food programs are down. It's something that you make part of your lifeways. And in this case scenario, these programs that were reintroducing agricultural to Navajo people are kind of funny to think about from that standpoint, because we know what corn means to us. We are made of corn. So to say that they're teaching us how to farm becomes quite demeaning at the same time, also very necessary, right? And so there's this play of what government programs can provide and how we can use them as like scaffolds. And then at a certain point, right, that traditional ecological knowledge has to step in to take the voice and the control of what's going on here. So that was one of my favorite images that we got a chance to take a look at. I'm not sure if you ladies wanted to address another one, or we could turn in to see if there's any questions from the audience at this point.
Lillia, do you want to do one, and then we can turn to the questions?
Sure. Just the one right before, I'll be very brief. This image has been cited 8 times in our manuscript. And I just think it's an incredible example of kind of the multiplicities of knowledge that one single photograph can evoke. We have 3 separate chapters in the book that speak to this photograph in particular, and all 3 authors evoke it in very diverse ways. And I think that the same can be true to any single exhibition and any single photograph in the book and in the exhibition. If you get 10 people in a room, you'll get 50 stories that come from that photograph, right? So I just wanted to share that, which will also, I think we can say, be the cover of the manuscript. And yeah, I think we're ready to open it to questions. I know we have like 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you all for staying for so long. We do have a website that we're working on updating. It's miltonsnowphotography.com.
Yeah.
Very cool. We have one question that's coming in the chat from David Perez. He says, I'm in a critical archives discussions group, and 1 month we read Decolonial Archive Futures. I found the work to be insightful. What would you recommend for those interested in visual sovereignty and interrogating and challenging the archives and the collections?
I have so many answers to that. I'm sure Dr. D does too. But the Society for American Archivists is working right now on policies and guidelines for archival repatriation. And there is information on that committee online, and kind of that's a really good entry point into thinking through work that's being done in archival studies right now. There's just an amazing breadth and depth of scholarship happening across contexts there.
Yeah, there's just too much. I can't even
Yeah.
begin to name one specifically. I mean, I just go through so much of just trying to keep track of what's being published. It's so I can't even think of one right off the top of my head.
I'd be happy to, if that person wants to email me, I'd be happy to share some resources that I found particularly useful.
Halea's work has been like
Yeah.
ridiculously fundamental. I think it's called Visual Sovereignty, but her particular chapter in there is Dragonfly, and the definitions of visual sovereignty as like this beautiful, as this like almost Gerald Visner kind of like deadly play with colonial like structures. Let's play with them and see what happens. But the ability to foster that with visual archives. And I know her big thing, I was very fortunate to study under her over at Davis, like even taking a look at postcards, right? Like start off at postcards. What were people interested in taking off a postcard? And then I always, and this is coming from a Native American studies, career person, whatever. I'm always very hesitant to like, let's say, okay, let's decolonize the archive, let's decolonize anthropology, let's decolonize this, because when we talk about decolonization, it's both an event and a process, as I teach my students, but it's one that you who is engaging it is willing to give up your life for. And we don't talk about it in those very serious terms, something that not just your life, but somebody who, like your children, you're willing to stake your livelihood on these actions for survivance, for self-determination, for existence, for sovereignty, all of these big political words. And so what we're taking a look at now with these archive movements is more along the lines of self-determination. How do we self-determine the archive, right? How do we utilize? And that brings up the wonderful, this image. I remember talking to Jennifer, is to think about how many images are still in that archive and to, encourage young scholars, old scholars, any type of scholar really, to start diving into the archive, taking a look and seeing what's there. Because even though it's dated, right, with new eyes, you'd be surprised what you can find with them and how you can pull them together. So that's what I have. I'm not sure if you ladies have do you have anything that you would like to add?
There's a couple of things that are in the Navajo Nation Museum exhibition that I wanted to be in there, and then Lillia and the consultants brought it into being. But there's a Taft Black Horse who if you don't know, is a very preeminent archaeologist, Diné archaeologist, whose expertise is in the histories of Diné of Chaco Canyon. So I found a 1938 statement by a Navajo Natani named Gray Eyes from Chinle in the Solon Kimball papers in the Newberry Library. I go to the Newberry Library quite a bit, and they've got quite a bit of Navajo related documents. So it's a 6-page statement. It was because Navajo people were largely illiterate in the English language. That's why photographs as visuals were used as education tool by Snow. Um, Gray Eyes' statement was probably spoken in Navajo, translated into English, and then I took it and we had it translated back into Denetdale. I gave the statement to Taft Black Horse so he could practice it and think about how he wanted to say it, what words he was going to use. It takes 19 minutes for him to read the transcript in Denetdale. And so when you go to the Navajo Nation Museum, you sit under the sound cone on this really incredible, fabulous bench made by Kelly Byers, who's a Choctaw sculptor and artist. You sit there and you hear it just in Denetdale. Okay. So to me, speaking the language and hearing it is part of bringing the archives alive and bringing forth these memories of what leaders were going through during that time, the tension, because Gray Eyes is speaking about his community members losing trust in him, you know. And then the other one at the end of the exhibition is 11-minute film that started out as an hour and 45 minutes interview that then Ramona Emerson put together for 19 minutes, and then the consultants and us, me and Lillia and Clarinda Begay, got it down to 11 minutes. Okay, and that's the story of, and Matt Fitzsimmons helped us with that one because he brought the primary documents to the family from Tisnaspons. And so that became the story about remembering and memory about our ancestors who resisted and the real-time consequences of resisting colonial forces, you know. And so I think those were really important for me to have in the exhibition.
And I think foundationally, we're kind of talking about reframing the way we think about the archive as not a place of knowledge retrieval, but as of knowledge production, right? And as a site for ethnography. There's a few scholars out there who are doing really interesting work on thinking through the archive as a site of ethnography, and specifically of state ethnography, thinking specifically about Audra Simpson's work, and thinking through the ways in which archives can be activated not only for storytelling and community use, but putting that community use and storytelling and mobilizing it for political goals.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
No, thank you guys. All right, I'm going to ask our, one final question. What was your favorite so far, right? Because we're not done yet. We're not done. You guys aren't done with this project yet. You still have the book coming out. So make sure that you guys, once that hits the Amazon, like reserve your copy, do that. And then, but if you guys could speak to your favorite memory so far, since we're closing with this concept of memory and archive, I always go to Diana Taylor, right, the archive and the repertoire. What has been your favorite experience so far in this adventure?
Oh my God, it was just so much fun and so much work. Um, you know, the Navajo Nation Museum staff, Shundi Jim, who's the director, they were just so receptive and so welcoming. It's still emotional. Like a couple of weeks, 2 weeks after the exhibition opened, I was just feeling really emotional, and I can't explain what those emotions are about spending 2 years of my life on this, and then you come to this point, and then like I'm just really feeling it. So Shandine, when we went to debrief with her in September, the staff told us that a daughter had come in with her elderly mother, and she told her mom, "We're just going to stop in and see it real quick." Grandma didn't want to leave. She said they spent like 3 or 4 hours there, and Grandma was looking at every single photograph. She spent that long in it, and then she said her mom broke down and cried, you know. And so having it's so wonderful to hear people's reception to the exhibition and how it evokes memories. And so I really appreciate those stories and that kind of for me it's an appreciation for an understanding of how I've spent my life. which is, this is life work, I'm planning a solo manuscript. I was talking to Marcia Weisiger, who wrote Dreaming of Sheep, which is a history of, she's an environmental historian of livestock reduction. And then mentioned this to Lillia a couple of times, is that when we're talking about there isn't any sheep, sheep's permits limit the number of sheep you can have. You can't make a living on it, that it's more tied to claims to land use than it is about sheep. That and then Clara Kelly, who's just an amazing person, who was on our consultant, was one of the people we worked with, talking about the condition of the land today, that from her observation and reading about livestock reduction, and Clara has probably walked every single square mile of the Navajo Nation in her career, that the land doesn't look much different is what we were talking about. So, there's a lot of things to think about and to reflect and to think about the legacy of land environment and deterioration, and how well sheep continue to be considered a form of wealth, even though most of us couldn't butcher to save our lives. I've herded sheep when I was young, but I certainly don't have any sheep. I got a lot of books though. Lillia? Okay, I'm done.
Um, to echo what Jennifer is saying, just the relationships that have been built throughout this process, and for me personally, with Jennifer and through other community members, has absolutely been the highlight of this project for me. With you, Chris, it is just a joy to be able to be in conversation and community with you all. But I will say, like, favorite memory was Jennifer and I living in Gallup together leading up to the opening. Which was just we have a lot of funny memories from that period. And yeah, it continues to be a privilege every day that I do not take for granted, to be able to be in these spaces with people like you two and the rest of our partners, not only at the Navajo Nation Museum, but at the Maxwell Museum as well.
Could we show that picture of snow? Because people don't know what snow looks like. We purposely, at both exhibitions, do not put them in the front, because this is not about white men. Okay, this is about a period in Diné history, and these photographs are about how my people see these photographs. So people are surprised sometimes because they don't know what he looks like, and he left us to the Navajo Nation Museum between 14 and 15,000 photographs. And there's a question also often about what his relationship was to Navajo people. He didn't leave much in terms of written documents, and so we can only assume what kinds of relationships he had with Navajo people. By all accounts, he had very positive relationships. And how do you tell that except by a photograph like this? Okay. So Lily, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I can briefly add something. I know we're over time,
We're-
but I think the kind of legacy of snow within Navajo communities is something that was really interesting for me to think with, and kind of an exercise in holding two things to be true at once, right? Like, snow was part of this larger history of Belaganas coming in and photographing Navajo people to serve American political goals, right? And that history is very real, and it had very long-lasting impacts that we still feel today, right? So I came in kind of gung-ho, very anti-snow, very seeing him in line with Curtis and everybody else within that lineage. But and then coming into this project and seeing the ways in which so many Diné people have these really strong, happy memories of him being a good community member and an ally to the community was a really kind of interesting exercise, not only for me personally, but how to display that dichotomy of two things being true at once in the exhibition.
I don't have the same kind of feelings about John Collier.
It's a different thing.
Very different. So that's
Awesome. Started off as a friend of the Navajos too, right? He started off a very positive relationship with the Navajos. It turned.
Collier.
Yeah, Collier. I've heard a whole bunch of stories about the initial relationships with Collier. It started off in I wouldn't say friendship, but more positive. Like he's seeking to, right, preserve the legacy of the indigenous populations. And so let's improve those. And then it took a fast forward and push drive into hard assimilation as termination policy techniques.
Oh, I don't ever see Collier as anything other than patronizing, condescending, and racist. Other than that, I've never bought the well-meaning, well-intentioned white man. I've never bought that trope.
Yeah.
And so I've always been like, no, I don't think so. I'm reading his memoir, and I think the whole construction of the narratives around him is about continuing these tropes about the well-intentioned white man. That's Snow's van that he drove around Navajo on. He had a makeshift lab inside the van, and he slept on top. Look at roads in the 30s and 40s. Well, I guess they're paths. So anyway, we're over time. I want to thank everybody for staying all the way, and we're all of us are available if you have any questions. I really want to thank Chris and Lillia for their generosity and being such good relatives in this project. It's just been a blessing to know both of you.
Yeah, same here. Head nana nsawak on nsok egidok on don't need the Maxwell Museum. Thank you. Hella nana ayo bahad yehntin adada hulya.
Mhm.